In the early morning hours of April 28th in the year 1903, the earth under the town of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey began to shake violently. It was sudden, intense, and completely unexpected. A powerful earthquake struck the region, reaching a surface wave magnitude of 7.0. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Manzikert, which today lies in Mus province, sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The ground beneath eastern Turkey is under constant pressure because it lies along the boundaries of major tectonic plates. The Arabian plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate from the south, while the Anatolian plate, which holds most of Turkey, is being squeezed and pushed westward. This collision zone has produced earthquakes for thousands of years and still does today. Back in 1903, there were no early warning systems. People had no way to prepare for what was coming. The shaking began without warning, and within minutes, homes, buildings, and entire neighborhoods had crumbled. The earthquake caused massive destruction across the region. 12,000 homes were completely destroyed. Not damaged, gone, flattened. For people living in rural villages with simple stone or mud brick homes, there was no protection when the earth turned violent. The shaking was so strong that the ground split in places, and landslides were triggered in nearby hills. Thousands of animals, over 20,000, died, many crushed in collapsed barns or caught in the chaos that followed. For a region that relied heavily on agriculture and livestock to survive, losing that many animals was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of livelihood. But the most heartbreaking toll was the human one. An estimated 3,500 people were killed in the disaster. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors were left digging through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for anyone who might still be alive. The sound of weeping and shouting filled the air in the hours after the shaking stopped. Nearby cities and towns like Erzurum and Bitlis felt the earthquake too. Though the damage there was less severe, buildings cracked and panic spread. Roads and trails used for travel became blocked by debris, making rescue efforts even harder. And because this was the early 20th century, there were no helicopters, no quick emergency teams. Help came slowly, by foot, by cart, or not at all. The people of Manzikert had no choice but to rely on each other. Neighbors helped neighbors, even while grieving their own losses. Makeshift shelters were set up using whatever materials could be found. Fires were lit to keep warm at night, as many were forced to sleep outside in the cold. The strong aftershocks kept coming, making it impossible for people to feel safe indoors. This earthquake would go on to be remembered as one of the deadliest in Turkish history. But it was only the beginning of the hardship. The full impact of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would be felt for years to come. As the days passed after the earthquake struck Manzikert, the damage began to reveal itself even more clearly. Survivors who had crawled out from collapsed homes began walking through their villages, seeing entire streets reduced to rubble. Stone walls had collapsed inward, roofs had caved in, and the narrow dirt roads were blocked with debris. In many places, there was nothing left standing. The landscape looked as though it had been torn apart by war. Relief was slow to arrive. In the early 1900s, the region was isolated. With limited infrastructure, there were no paved highways or motor vehicles. The only ways to reach Manzikert were by foot, horseback, or donkey carts, and the trails were damaged or blocked by landslides. News of the earthquake spread slowly. Weeks went by before help from distant cities began to trickle in. In the meantime, the survivors had to rely entirely on local resources. Many had lost everything. Families were now homeless, living in temporary shelters made from wooden planks and canvas, or huddling in caves and open fields. With their livestock gone and food supplies buried under rubble, hunger and illness started to take hold. Clean water was scarce, and without proper sanitation, diseases quickly began to spread. It was no longer just an earthquake disaster, it was now a humanitarian crisis. The psychological toll on the survivors was heavy. Every aftershock brought fresh fear. People were afraid to sleep indoors, even in buildings that were still standing. Children cried at the sound of the ground rumbling, and adults kept one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that signaled a new collapse or landslide. Entire communities were gripped by fear and uncertainty. Beyond Manzikert, the earthquake was felt across much of eastern Anatolia. In cities like Erzurum and Bitlis, the shaking caused damage to important structures. Mosques, markets, and schools showed signs of cracking, and some smaller buildings collapsed. Though the destruction was not as complete as in Manzikert, it served as a reminder of just how far-reaching the earthquake had been. Even regions not directly in the epicenter were affected economically and emotionally. In the countryside surrounding Manzikert, farmers were devastated. The land had shifted, irrigation systems were damaged or destroyed, fields were torn apart, and in some areas, the soil had been displaced so badly that planting crops was no longer possible. Entire growing seasons were lost. Combined with the deaths of 20,000 animals, it meant that famine was now a looming threat. The Ottoman authorities at the time did what they could, but the response was limited. There was no central disaster agency, no stockpile of supplies, no formal rescue teams. Aid depended heavily on local governors, religious leaders, and community volunteers. Donations were sent from neighboring provinces, and religious institutions helped organize relief, but resources were stretched thin. The disaster exposed the vulnerability of rural communities in eastern Turkey. Most homes had been built from sun-dried bricks or local stones, materials that stood no chance against a major quake. The collapse of these homes wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a sign of how unprepared the region was for a natural disaster of this size. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manzikert began the slow process of digging out what they could. Personal belongings were retrieved from the ruins, but for many there was little to find. Entire family histories, photos, books, heirlooms had been buried or burned. Yet amid the loss, there were small moments of hope. People who had been presumed dead were found alive. Buried under beams or inside pockets of collapsed rooms, rescued by neighbors who refused to give up searching. The memory of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would remain etched in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. But this was only the early phase of a much longer journey. Recovery would take years, and the scars left by the earthquake, both physical and emotional, would run deep. Months after the earthquake, the people of Manzikert were still struggling to return to anything close to normal. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it new challenges. With so many buildings destroyed and clean water supplies either buried or contaminated, sanitation had become a serious problem. Flies gathered around waste and rotting animal carcasses that had not been properly buried. Sickness was spreading rapidly. Typhoid and dysentery were common. With limited medical knowledge and no modern hospitals nearby, even treatable illnesses became deadly. The destruction of homes and livestock had left thousands of people dependent on whatever help they could get. Food shortages were growing worse. Crops planted earlier in the spring had withered in fields that could no longer be properly irrigated. Entire harvests had failed. Families were now relying on donated grains, dried fruits, and whatever animals they had managed to save. The loss of 20,000 animals was not just a number. It meant fewer plows, no milk, no transportation, and no meat for entire communities. Despite the devastation, some rebuilding efforts had started. Using what materials they could find, wood, salvaged bricks, mud, people began putting up temporary homes. These makeshift shelters offered little protection against the weather, but they were a sign that the town was not giving up. Stonemasons and laborers came from neighboring villages to help, even though many of them had suffered losses themselves. In the absence of formal engineering knowledge, homes were rebuilt in much the same way they had been before, leaving them just as vulnerable to future quakes. Religious leaders played a big role during this time. Mosques that had survived the shaking became gathering places not only for worship, but for organizing food distribution and community decisions. Clerics gave sermons focused on strength and perseverance, and many people found comfort and faith when there was little else to hold onto. Beyond the town itself, the government had begun taking notes. The Ottoman Empire, still in its final decades, was under pressure from multiple sides: financially, politically, and militarily. Natural disasters like the Manzikert quake only added more stress. Officials sent reports back to Istanbul detailing the destruction, and engineers were dispatched to evaluate the damage. While resources were limited, the disaster helped push the discussion about earthquake risks into broader political conversations. Meanwhile, researchers of the time began paying closer attention to the geology of the region. Though modern seismology was still in its infancy, it was becoming clear that eastern Anatolia was resting on unstable ground. Scientists noted that the region was close to the junction between two major fault systems, the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. These faults were now being studied more closely, and there were early theories forming about the movement of plates and how stress in the Earth's crust could build over time until it suddenly released in a violent quake. In addition to the main earthquake in April, there were multiple aftershocks over the following weeks and months. One of the more powerful ones struck on the 6th of August, causing new damage to buildings that had survived the initial quake. Some people who had started rebuilding saw their homes collapse again. A few were injured, and the fear that had briefly started to fade came roaring back. Many residents began questioning whether it was even safe to remain in the region. Despite the suffering, people found ways to survive. Communities worked together, sharing tools, food, and even space. Entire families moved in together under single roofs. Children played in the dust and rubble, finding moments of laughter amid the hardship. Weddings were still held, funerals still observed, and markets slowly reopened. Bit by bit, life was continuing, even if it looked completely different than before. For the people of Manzikert, the earthquake had not just destroyed buildings, it had changed the rhythm of their lives, shifted their priorities, and forced them to rethink how they would live in a land that could shake without warning. But they kept going, one day at a time, trying to rebuild not just their homes, but the future. In the years that followed the 1903 Manzikert earthquake, the tragedy stayed fresh in people's memories. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and lost. Family members buried under collapsed roofs, animals crushed in barns, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The ground beneath their feet had once felt solid, dependable. Now every tremor, every creak of a shifting house beam sparked a fear that was hard to forget. Across the region, this earthquake became one of the key moments that helped shift how people understood natural disasters. Before then, earthquakes were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment, unpredictable and unavoidable. But the scale of the Manzikert disaster forced people to ask new questions. Could something like this happen again? Was it possible to prepare or even to prevent such destruction? At the time, formal earthquake science was still very limited, especially in eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire. There were no warning systems, no emergency response plans, and little public understanding of how earthquakes worked. But slowly that began to change. Scholars and engineers began paying more attention to the fault lines running through the Anatolian region. Reports were written, diagrams drawn, and early versions of risk maps were developed by experts in Istanbul and abroad. The Ottoman government, though strained and declining, did begin to gather more earthquake data. They compiled damage reports from towns like Manzikert, Erzurum, and Bitlis. These records would later help future researchers understand which parts of the country were most at risk. The memory of the 1903 disaster also started conversations about the need for safer buildings, though large-scale changes in construction would not fully come into place until decades later. Even without modern engineering, local builders and masons began to change their methods. In the years after the quake, new homes were often made shorter with thicker walls and stronger support beams. People experimented with new materials when they gained a current they could get them, hoping to avoid the same total collapse if another quake hit. Though these improvements were small, they marked the start of a long journey toward earthquake-resistant design. The disaster also left behind lessons in human resilience. Communities that had been torn apart slowly rebuilt themselves. Fields were planted again. Children born after the quake grew up hearing stories of survival and loss. Local traditions of sharing and mutual aid grew stronger. In some villages, neighbors formed informal watch groups that kept an eye out for signs of danger, shifting rocks, strange animal behavior, or unusual ground movement. Manzikert itself never forgot what happened. For decades, the earthquake remained part of its identity. Stories were passed down from elders to children, describing the moment the earth cracked open and the dust swallowed everything. The quake had reshaped more than just the land. It had changed the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Across Turkey, the Manzikert quake is now remembered as one of the earliest major disasters of the 20th century. It helped lay the groundwork for future efforts in earthquake preparedness, though progress would take many years. By the end of the 20th century, more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had struck the country, killing more than 100,000 people and injuring many more. Each one added new urgency to the call for safety and preparedness. And today, Turkey has modern seismology centers, early warning systems, and strict building codes in many regions. These advances were not born overnight. They came from decades of hard lessons, of loss and recovery, and the 1903 Manzikert earthquake was one of the earliest and most painful lessons of all. The scars left behind by that earthquake are no longer visible in rubble, but they remain in the country's memory. They remind us of the quiet danger that lives beneath our feet and the strength that people can find when everything falls apart. In the days leading up to the deadly typhoon that struck Hong Kong in the early morning hours of Tuesday, September 18th of the year 1906, there was no real sign of the devastation that was about to unfold. Life in the city was moving along like usual. Hong Kong at the time was a growing British colony and a busy international port. Streets were filled with people going about their day, shopkeepers opening stores, boats crowding the harbor, trams running through the heart of the city, and locals navigating their daily routines. There had been storms before, of course. Typhoons weren't new to the region, but this one would end up being one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. The warning signs were subtle at first. The barometer began to drop steadily on the morning of the storm. Between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock that morning, the pressure fell from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. This might not mean much to the average person, but to those watching the skies, like the Hong Kong Observatory, it was clear that something serious was developing. Still, there wasn't much time. At 8:40 in the morning, a black drum was raised by the observatory, which was the official warning signal at the time for tropical cyclones. But this was barely 30 minutes before the full force of the typhoon hit. Unfortunately, this short notice left almost no time for preparations. By 9 o'clock, ferries had stopped operating, but it was already too late for many. Foreign steamer captains and their crews, stranded on land, had no time to reach their vessels and secure them. Some people didn't even realize the danger until it was upon them. That's how fast it moved. Despite some warnings being telegraphed days earlier from Japan and Shanghai, it wasn't until the morning of the 18th that most people in Hong Kong knew anything was wrong. It caught nearly everyone off guard. The typhoon itself had formed several days earlier, around Saturday, September 15th, near the Bashi Channel to the southeast of Hong Kong. It was first spotted by Japanese meteorologists east of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. Ships passing through the Pacific Ocean also recorded changes in wind and pressure. But back in Hong Kong, where communication systems were limited and weather tracking was still a developing science, the urgency of those early warnings didn't make their way to the people in time. By the time the typhoon approached Hong Kong, it had grown into a powerful storm with winds swirling around a massive core. The eye of the storm was recorded just 30 nautical miles away, with wind speeds reaching 24 miles per hour as it neared the city. While that might not sound extremely fast, what made this storm deadly was its sheer size and intensity. The wind force extended across an area about 100 miles in diameter. The winds were violent, but the real damage came from what followed: the rising water, the massive waves, and the terrifying storm surge. As people in the city began to realize that this was no ordinary storm, panic set in. Boats were rushed to shelter if they could make it, markets shut down. People ran for cover, trying to find solid ground or shelter indoors. The skies grew darker and the air grew heavier. For many, it was already too late to escape what was coming, and still no one could have predicted how bad things would get. The typhoon was just beginning its path of destruction, and within hours, it would change the city forever. As the sun rose over Hong Kong on the morning of Tuesday, September 18th, the air was thick and unusually still. Most residents were completely unaware that a massive storm was racing toward the city. At around 8:40 in the morning, the Royal Observatory hoisted the black drum signal, a warning system used since the year 1884 to alert of approaching tropical cyclones. Just minutes later, the typhoon gun was fired at the harbor, sounding the alarm that danger was imminent. But by that point, it was already too late for many. The typhoon had moved in fast. In just 2 hours, barometer readings dropped rapidly, from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. That kind of drop signaled a sudden and extreme pressure change, a sure sign of the approaching storm's intensity. By 9 in the morning, ferry services had already come to a halt, and people were stranded all across the harbor. Many foreign steamer crews couldn't reach their vessels in time to prepare, leaving countless ships vulnerable as the storm swept in. The winds picked up with terrifying speed. The Hong Kong Observatory measured a velocity of 24 miles per hour when the eye of the storm was still 30 nautical miles away. That might not sound fast at first, but with a storm of this scale, those winds carried an unstoppable force. In a matter of minutes, the sea became a boiling mess of churning waves and crashing surf. Tidal waves slammed against the shoreline, flooding entire coastal areas before anyone had time to react. Along the waterfront, the rising water broke down sea walls, carried away small boats, and smashed wooden piers to splinters. The typhoon's full power became tragically clear as it hit during high tide. Thousands of people living in vulnerable coastal areas were directly in its path. For many Chinese families living on houseboats, some of the nearly 5,000 registered watercraft in the city, there was no escape. The storm struck so quickly that few could make it to shore. Along the stretch from West Point to Causeway Bay, sampans and lighters were tossed into one another like toys. Entire communities living on the water disappeared in an instant. By mid-morning, buildings on land were also being torn apart. Roof tiles and glass rained down into the streets. Electric tram lines on Hong Kong Island came to a stop when wiring systems were ripped apart. The Peak tram was also forced to shut down after damage to its signal cables and nearby tracks. On Bowen Road, fallen trees and debris made entire routes impassable. At the Botanical Gardens, many trees were destroyed, although the zoological section somehow made it through untouched. The storm showed no mercy. At West Point, major warehouses, including those owned by Jardine, Matheson, and Jebsen and Company, lost their roofs and had their walls ripped away. Piers collapsed across the Central District, including the Star Ferry Wharf, Blake Pier, and Queen's Statue Wharf. Even newly constructed landmarks like the General Post Office and the Supreme Court site were heavily damaged, their bamboo scaffolding torn down and scattered across nearby roads. This typhoon didn't just damage a few structures. It overwhelmed every part of life in Hong Kong, from transportation and housing to public safety and communication. And all of it happened in just a few short hours, leaving the city in shock and on its knees. But as devastating as this was, the true scale of the disaster would only become clear as people began searching for loved ones in the wreckage. Next, we'll look at the tragedy that unfolded in the harbor, with ships sunk, hundreds of lives lost, and heroic rescues carried out in the middle of the storm. As the typhoon continued its assault on Hong Kong, the waters of Victoria Harbor turned into a deadly trap. The chaos reached its peak between 10 in the morning and noon, when winds blew with hurricane force and the sea surged over the seawalls. The harbor, normally a place of trade and activity, became unrecognizable. Massive waves rose up without warning, some said to be over 30 feet high, crashing down on vessels of all sizes. More than 200 ships and boats were damaged or sunk. Among them were ferries, cargo steamers, and fishing junks. The Chung Shan, a large steamer, was thrown from its mooring and slammed into the dockside before capsizing. The Yunnan, another vessel anchored near Kowloon, broke free and collided with smaller boats before vanishing beneath the waves. The Japanese freighter Asama Maru, caught in the path of the storm while attempting to leave port, lost control and drifted until it struck a pier. Its hull was badly damaged, but it managed to remain afloat. Countless smaller boats were not so fortunate. Entire fleets of sampans, which served as both homes and workplaces for many families, were shattered by debris or dashed against sea walls. Witnesses later described seeing people clinging to pieces of wreckage or trying to swim through oil-coated water, screaming for help as strong currents pulled them under. The sounds of splintering wood and cries for rescue echoed through the harbor. Rescue efforts began while the storm still raged. British Navy personnel from the HMS Tamar risked their lives by launching lifeboats into the rough water, pulling dozens of people to safety. Police and fire crews also worked to save those trapped on the docks and in partially sunken ships. Some managed to haul survivors up by ropes and ladders, even as the wind threatened to blow them into the sea themselves. Others could only watch helplessly as overturned boats floated past with no signs of life on board. One of the most heartbreaking scenes unfolded near Aberdeen, on the southern side of Hong Kong Island. A fleet of fishing boats had tried to take shelter in the narrow inlet there, but the wind shifted suddenly and a massive wave surged into the harbor mouth. Within minutes, more than 40 boats were overturned or crushed together. Entire families were lost, including children and elderly relatives who had been asleep below deck when the storm hit. As the winds finally began to weaken around midday, the damage was already staggering. Oil from damaged freighters spread across the water, mixing with floating debris, splintered wood, and unclaimed belongings. The sea, once the heart of Hong Kong's lifeline, had become a floating graveyard. The worst was not yet over, though. Survivors began emerging from shelters, only to find their homes destroyed and loved ones missing. With communication lines down and roads blocked, news of the disaster spread slowly. It would take several more days before the full human cost became known. As we wrap up, we'll explore the impact on land, how entire neighborhoods were flattened, how hospitals struggled to keep up with the wounded, and how the government began the long and painful process of recovering from one of the worst typhoons in Hong Kong's history. In the aftermath of the typhoon, the people of Hong Kong faced a long road to recovery. In the weeks that followed, efforts to clear debris and restore order were carried out mostly by hand, using basic tools. Communication lines had been knocked out, and it took days before messages could be sent to nearby cities for assistance. Supplies were slow to arrive. What little help did come had to be delivered by sea, as many roads were blocked or destroyed. The colonial government conducted an inquiry to understand how the storm had caused so much damage and loss of life. Reports from that time revealed not only the limits of existing infrastructure, but also how ill-prepared the region was for a storm of that strength. The storm pushed the city to think more seriously about long-term planning. In the years that followed, improvements were made to breakwaters and harbor facilities. More attention was given to weather observation, and the typhoon warning system was gradually expanded. But for the people who lived through it, the typhoon left a permanent scar. Many survivors lost their homes, their families, or their livelihoods. For fishermen and harbor workers in particular, the disaster was devastating. Some left the region entirely, while others stayed and rebuilt, one wall at a time. The 1906 Hong Kong typhoon is still remembered today as one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. It highlighted the need for better preparedness, better infrastructure, and better understanding of nature's power. While the city has grown into a modern metropolis over the past century, the memory of that storm remains a reminder that even the most advanced societies are never fully in control when it comes to the force of nature. The summer of 2003 marked an unprecedented natural disaster across Europe. The heatwave that would go down in history as one of the most severe and deadly heat events the continent had ever experienced. Temperatures soared to extreme levels, reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius in many areas, and in some places the heat persisted for days on end. The heat wave was particularly harsh in countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, where the high temperatures were not only record-breaking, but also relentlessly persistent. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary summer heat, this was a crisis, one that would claim more than 70,000 lives across Europe. In France, the impact of the heat wave was especially severe. The country's typical mild summers were no match for the scorching temperatures that engulfed the nation. Cities like Paris, known for their pleasant summer weather, found themselves under a relentless heat dome, with temperatures rising well above 40 degrees Celsius for multiple days in a row. In fact, the highest temperature ever recorded in France at the time, 44.1 degrees Celsius, was a shocking reminder of just how extreme the heat had become. This sudden and extreme shift in weather took many people by surprise. Unlike other parts of the world, France was not equipped to handle such intense heat, especially in residential areas where central air conditioning was rare. The heat wave in France did more than just make the air unbearably hot. It brought health risks that many were unprepared for. Dehydration, heat stroke, and heat-related illnesses surged, particularly among the elderly and young children. With hospitals quickly overwhelmed, it became clear that the French health system was not prepared for an event of this magnitude. The death toll from this heat wave in France alone reached over 14,000, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's history. But France was not the only country feeling the heat. Across southern Europe, the effects were widespread and devastating. In Spain and Portugal, the heat wave led to similarly catastrophic outcomes. Temperatures soared to near 50 degrees Celsius in parts of Spain, and the combination of intense heat and drought created the perfect conditions for wildfires. These fires ravaged forests, destroyed homes, and took lives. In Portugal, nearly 2,000 people died due to the heat, with rural areas bearing the brunt of the damage. The situation was worsened by freak storms that swept through the southern regions, further increasing the danger and disrupting already fragile infrastructures. Even the typically cooler northern parts of Spain were not spared, as temperatures soared to levels never before seen, breaking decades-old records. The heatwave was not just a weather event, it was a major public health emergency that exposed the lack of preparedness across many countries in Europe. Most of these nations had not considered such extreme heat to be a serious threat, as their climates were not typically prone to such high temperatures. For instance, in the United Kingdom, temperatures reached an all-time high of 38.5 degrees Celsius. While this may not sound as extreme compared to other countries, it was the highest temperature ever recorded in the UK at the time. The heat put immense pressure on healthcare systems, utilities, and governments, all of which scrambled to cope with the health crisis and infrastructural challenges posed by the relentless heat. As this intense period of heat continued into August, it became clear that the impact was far-reaching. The severe temperatures were exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, particularly in large cities like Paris. The heat island effect occurs when cities, with their buildings, roads, and limited greenery, trap and retain heat, making them even hotter than surrounding rural areas. This made it difficult for residents to escape the oppressive heat, particularly at night when temperatures remained high, providing little relief. The European heat wave of 2003 not only tested the resilience of communities, but also highlighted the need for urgent changes in how countries handle extreme weather events. The health consequences were just the beginning. What was happening across Europe was a preview of the kind of climate challenges that the future might hold if action wasn't taken to prepare and adapt. But at the time, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the effects would be. As Europe baked under the scorching sun, the true magnitude of the disaster began to unfold, setting the stage for the even more devastating days to come. As the heat wave stretched into August, it became clear that the conditions were far from ordinary. The combination of high-pressure systems and persistent southerly winds from the Sahara Desert resulted in a relentless wave of heat across Europe. This heat was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. The conditions were so extreme that many regions were breaking temperature records that had stood for decades. In France, for example, the temperature reached an astonishing 44.1 degrees Celsius, which was the highest temperature ever recorded in the country. This extreme heat became a serious health risk for many, especially the elderly, young children, and those with pre-existing health conditions. For countries like France, where the summers were typically mild, this sudden surge in temperatures caused a major public health crisis. In many areas, people simply weren't prepared for this kind of heat. Air conditioning was not common in most homes, particularly in the northern regions of France, where summers were rarely this hot. As a result, many people had no way to cool down, making them vulnerable to heat-related illnesses like heat stroke and dehydration. The situation was worsened by the urban heat island effect, where cities with their dense concrete and asphalt absorbed and retained heat more than rural areas, making the temperatures in cities even hotter. The heat wave in France led to over 14,000 heat-related deaths, with most of the victims being elderly people who were unable to cope with the extreme heat. The situation was dire, and as temperatures climbed higher, hospitals and emergency services found themselves overwhelmed with people suffering from heat-related illnesses. This strain on the health system delayed treatments, which only added to the death toll. In some places, the government took action, setting up helplines for concerned citizens and providing information on how to stay cool and hydrated, but by then the damage had already been done. In Portugal, the heat wave was equally catastrophic. A combination of high temperatures and dry conditions led to widespread wildfires, with the intense heat fanning the flames and making them harder to control. The record-breaking temperatures with nighttime lows still above 30 degrees Celsius caused further stress on both people and infrastructure. In addition to the human toll, the agricultural sector also took a massive hit. The drought created crop shortages affecting food production across the region. The damage to agriculture led to long-term economic consequences, and as the heat wave raged on, the consequences of the extreme weather became painfully clear. Across Europe, the heat wave was leaving its mark not just in the form of heat-related deaths, but also in terms of the damage to infrastructure. Many countries experienced power outages as the demand for electricity soared, with air conditioning units working overtime to try and keep buildings cool. The strain on power grids was intense, and the infrastructure in many areas was simply not built to handle this level of demand. The agricultural sector was not the only one affected. Water shortages also became an issue as rivers and lakes, which were crucial sources of water for both drinking and irrigation, began to dry up. These extreme conditions, however, were not limited to just one or two countries. The heat wave spread across much of Europe, with countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany also experiencing devastating heat and drought. The Netherlands, for instance, recorded temperatures as high as 37.8 degrees Celsius. This was close to the national record, which had stood for more than a century. This unusual heat was felt in both urban and rural areas, and just like in other affected countries, the elderly were particularly vulnerable. While the heat wave did not break records in every country, the intensity and length of the event were unprecedented in most places. In Germany, the heat caused severe disruptions in shipping on the Elbe and Danube rivers. Low water levels, a result of the ongoing drought, made it difficult for ships to navigate. This not only impacted transportation, but also affected the economy, as fewer goods could be moved via these critical waterways. Similarly, power plants in countries like Germany had to reduce their output due to the high water temperatures in rivers, which made it unsafe to cool their reactors. With the combination of heat and drought affecting so many sectors, the broader economic impact was becoming undeniable. As the temperatures stayed high and the situation worsened, it was becoming clearer that the aftermath of the heatwave would be felt long after the weather returned to normal. The 2003 heatwave was not just a summer event, it marked a turning point in how Europe would approach extreme weather. It revealed how vulnerable many countries were to such events and exposed the gaps in public health systems, emergency preparedness, and infrastructure. The intense heat, the health risks, and the economic toll made it clear that something needed to be done to prevent or mitigate future disasters. As the heatwave continued to ravage Europe, it became apparent that the extreme weather was having a profound effect on the environment. Forests, fields, and farmlands, which were already under strain from the lack of rainfall, were now facing the additional burden of record-high temperatures. The drought was especially devastating for crops, and the effects were felt across much of the agricultural sector. In countries like Spain and Italy, where agriculture is a key part of the economy, the consequences were immediate. Fields of wheat, corn, and olives dried up, and many farmers faced the tragic reality of losing their harvests. The economic toll was significant, with billions of euros in damages across Europe's agricultural industry. The heatwave also led to an increased risk of wildfires. With the combination of dry vegetation and high winds, the stage was set for catastrophic fires to break out. In Portugal, the situation became dire as fires spread rapidly across the country. Fueled by the dry conditions and intense heat, the fires threatened both rural and urban areas, and thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes to avoid being trapped by the flames. The firefighting efforts were complicated by the extreme heat, making it harder to control the fires and protect homes and infrastructure. Portugal was not alone in facing these dangers. In Spain, Italy, and France, wildfires broke out as well, leading to further evacuations and destruction of property. The fires not only claimed lives, but also caused significant damage to the natural environment, with vast areas of forest and wildlife habitats being destroyed. Wildlife was another group that suffered severely during the heatwave. The drought reduced the availability of food and water for many species, forcing animals to seek out new areas for survival. In some regions, animals were found wandering in urban areas searching for water. The heat also put stress on aquatic life, with rivers, lakes, and streams drying up or reaching dangerously low levels. Fish and other aquatic species were at risk due to the increase in water temperature, which led to oxygen depletion in some bodies of water. The delicate balance of ecosystems across Europe was disturbed, and many experts warned that the long-term effects on biodiversity could be severe if such heat waves became more frequent. The situation was further complicated by the human response to the heat. As temperatures soared, many people took to rivers and lakes in an attempt to cool down, only to find that these bodies of water were already dangerously low. The lack of water made it harder for people to stay hydrated, which only contributed to the rise in heat-related illnesses. Hospitals continued to be overwhelmed, and while many governments provided resources to assist the public, the scale of the crisis made it difficult to address every need. Additionally, the heatwave had significant long-term consequences for Europe's infrastructure. As the ground dried out, the earth beneath roads and buildings shifted, causing cracks and structural damage. Railway tracks were especially vulnerable, with some sections buckling under the extreme heat, disrupting travel. The heat caused concrete to crack and asphalt to soften, leading to delays and safety concerns on the roads. Airports in many regions experienced delays as ground crews struggled to deal with the heat, and air travel became less reliable. The cost of repairing the damage to infrastructure was enormous, and many European countries found themselves facing bills that stretched into the billions. The economic losses did not end with agriculture and infrastructure. The heat wave caused significant problems for the tourism industry as well. In countries like France and Italy, where tourism is a major part of the economy, travelers stayed away due to the unbearable heat. Resort areas and historical sites saw fewer visitors, and many outdoor events were canceled due to the risk of heat-related health problems. On the flip side, there was a rise in demand for air conditioning and cooling systems, leading to a spike in sales, but this only added to the strain on power grids. Perhaps one of the most sobering outcomes of the 2003 heatwave was the realization that climate change could be a driving force behind such extreme events. Scientists and climate experts began to warn that, as global temperatures continued to rise, Europe could expect more frequent and severe heat waves in the coming decades. This prompted governments across the continent to take a closer look at their climate policies and disaster preparedness plans. While the heat wave eventually subsided, the lessons learned from this disaster were far from forgotten. European governments began to implement measures aimed at mitigating the impacts of extreme weather, including heat action plans, better urban planning to prevent the urban heat island effect, and investments in green technologies. The aftermath of the 2003 heat wave highlighted the vulnerability of Europe to extreme weather events and underscored the importance of both local and global efforts to combat climate change. The severity of the heat, its economic consequences, and the toll it took on human and animal life left a lasting impact. It was no longer a question of whether such events would happen again, but rather, when. The heat wave in its wake set the stage for greater awareness of climate risks and the urgent need for adaptation strategies to protect both people and the planet from the intensifying impacts of climate change. As the years passed after the intense heat wave of 2003, Europe began to adapt to the rising threat of extreme weather. The lessons learned from that summer would inform a series of responses aimed at minimizing the impacts of future climate events. One of the most significant changes was in the way cities approached urban planning and environmental sustainability. In the wake of the heat wave, many European cities began to incorporate more green spaces into their urban landscapes. By creating parks, rooftop gardens, and increasing tree cover, cities hope to reduce the urban heat island effect, which causes cities to be much warmer than surrounding rural areas due to the dense concentration of buildings and human activity. Many governments also took steps to improve early warning systems for extreme weather. Heat waves, which had previously been seen as occasional anomalies, were now recognized as potentially life-threatening events. Across Europe, national meteorological services worked to enhance their forecasting abilities, while health departments developed heat action plans to protect vulnerable populations. In some countries, special measures were introduced to ensure that elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions had access to cooling centers and could avoid the dangerous heat. Hospitals also ramped up preparedness to manage heat-related illnesses, including heat stroke and dehydration. In addition to heat-related precautions, there was a growing emphasis on reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. Following the extreme heat of 2003, the European Union and its member states intensified their efforts to meet climate goals, aiming to limit global warming. Renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power began to receive more attention and investment, with the EU setting ambitious targets for reducing carbon footprints. The development of energy-efficient technologies and the promotion of public transportation helped decrease reliance on fossil fuels, which contributed to both global warming and the frequency of extreme weather events. Farmers, too, took action in response to the harsh conditions that had devastated crops during the heat wave. In countries where agriculture was a key industry, new farming techniques were introduced to help adapt to changing climate conditions. Drought-resistant crops were developed and tested, and irrigation systems were upgraded to conserve water. Additionally, many farmers invested in technologies to monitor weather patterns and soil moisture levels, which helped them make more informed decisions about planting and harvesting. These measures aim to increase resilience and ensure that European agriculture could survive and thrive, even in the face of increasing climate uncertainty. Despite these efforts, the memory of the heat wave remained vivid, and many were still grappling with the lingering effects. Water shortages were a continuous concern, and many regions began to explore new methods for water conservation and management. The drought conditions, which had plagued large parts of Europe in 2003, had become an ongoing challenge. Countries began to invest in desalination plants and other water-saving technologies to ensure that they could meet the growing demands of both their populations and their agricultural sectors. As the climate continued to change, the conversation around heat waves and extreme weather shifted from being about recovery to being about preparation. No longer were such events seen as rare occurrences, but rather as inevitable risks that needed to be planned for. Governments focused not just on reducing the immediate damage caused by heat waves, but on developing long-term strategies for climate adaptation. This included improving the resilience of infrastructure, investing in renewable energy, and enhancing public health systems to deal with the ongoing threats posed by extreme weather. While the heatwave of 2003 had been an unprecedented event, it was no longer an isolated incident. In the years that followed, other European countries experienced similarly devastating heat waves, leading to the realization that climate change was not just a future threat, it was already here. The lesson of the heat wave was clear: extreme weather events, fueled by rising global temperatures, would only become more frequent and intense, and it was up to governments, businesses, and individuals to prepare for the inevitable. In conclusion, the heat wave of 2003 served as a wake-up call for Europe. It forced the continent to confront the reality of climate change and the profound impact that extreme weather can have on human life, ecosystems, and economies. The widespread devastation it caused in terms of loss of life, crop failure, wildfires, and infrastructure damage was a turning point in how Europe understood its vulnerability to climate change. The steps taken in the aftermath of the heat wave, from changes in urban planning to the promotion of renewable energy, set the foundation for a more resilient Europe. While the long-term consequences of climate change remain uncertain, the lessons from that summer continue to guide efforts to protect the planet and its people from the increasing threat of extreme weather.